Hello, and welcome back to the channel. The Netherlands is often described as one of the best places in the world to live. It consistently ranks among the richest, safest, and most developed countries on Earth. Its cities are clean, its infrastructure is efficient, and its economy appears strong and stable. And yet, for millions of people, living in the Netherlands has quietly become almost impossible. Over the past decade, something fundamental has changed. In just 10 years, the average price of a Dutch home has risen from around 230,000 euros to well over 430,000 euros. In some cities, it is far higher. In Amsterdam, the average home price now exceeds 500,000 euros. In Utrecht, even small apartments regularly sell for sums that were once unimaginable for a middle-class household. Renting has become no easier. In major cities, one-bedroom apartments often cost more than 2,000 euros per month. Studios smaller than 20 square meters can demand rents that rival full-family homes from just a generation ago. For many people, especially students and young professionals, the numbers simply do not add up. Social housing, once a cornerstone of Dutch stability, offers little relief. Waiting lists that once lasted months now stretch 10, sometimes even 15 years. Homelessness has risen by more than 40% in a single decade, and at the same time, wages have barely moved. Over the last 20 years, real earnings in the Netherlands increased by only 3 to 5%. Housing prices, meanwhile, more than doubled. This gap between income and housing costs has reshaped everyday life. Two full-time salaries are often no longer enough to buy even a modest apartment. Teachers, nurses, and police officers struggle to live in the cities they serve. Students send out hundreds of housing applications and receive no response at all. Some sleep in temporary hostels, gyms, or travel hours each day just to attend classes. What makes this situation so striking is the contrast between perception and reality. From the outside, the Netherlands looks like a model country. Strong institutions, careful planning, long-term stability. But beneath that surface, pressure has been building for decades. In just 1 year, the Netherlands added more than 220,000 new residents. That is one of the fastest population growth rates in the country's modern history. Yet the supply of homes, infrastructure, and public services has not kept pace. For a country that built its reputation on planning and order, this raises an uncomfortable question. How did life become so difficult in a place that appears so successful? Many people think they already know the answer. They point to expats, international students, asylum seekers, or foreign investors. These explanations dominate public debate because they are visible, immediate, and politically charged. And while they do influence demand, they did not create the crisis. They accelerated a problem that was already decades in the making. To understand what is really happening, we need to zoom out. The Netherlands is one of the most densely populated countries on Earth. It has more people per square kilometer than Japan, India, or the United Kingdom. Even small increases in population place immediate pressure on housing, transport, and land use. But today's growth is not small. In the 1,990 seconds, the Netherlands grew by roughly 60,000 people per year. Today, that number has more than tripled. Population growth is now 3 to 4 times faster than it was just 1 generation ago. This strain has become so severe that housing has overtaken immigration, climate policy, and healthcare as the #1 political issue in national elections. And yet, despite this pressure, the Netherlands builds fewer homes per capita than many comparable countries. Across the European Union, the average country builds about 5 new homes per 1,000 residents each year. The Netherlands builds barely 3. Countries with similar land constraints, such as Denmark and Belgium, consistently build more. At the same time, Dutch households carry one of the highest mortgage debt levels in the world, exceeding 100% of GDP. The system that once delivered stability now struggles to adapt. Planning procedures have grown slower and more complex. Permitting times have increased rather than decreased. Construction projects face regulatory uncertainty that can delay development for years. Even as demand surges, supply remains constrained. This creates a fragile equilibrium. A housing market stretched to its limits, operating under the assumption that growth will remain manageable. But that assumption no longer holds. What we are witnessing is not a sudden collapse. It is the result of long-term structural imbalances finally being exposed under unprecedented pressure. To understand why the Netherlands struggles to house its own population today, we have to go back several decades, long before today's headlines, protests, or political debates. In the decades following World War II, the Netherlands faced an enormous housing shortage. Entire cities had been damaged. Populations were growing quickly, and demand for homes was intense. The response was decisive. From the 1950 through the 1970, the country built aggressively. At its peak, the Netherlands constructed between 120,000 and 150,000 new homes every single year. This era shaped modern Dutch society. Housing was not treated as a speculative asset, it was treated as infrastructure, something essential like roads, schools, or water systems. The goal was stability, affordability, predictability. By the 1980 seconds, nearly 45% of all homes in the Netherlands were owned by housing corporations. Social housing was not a niche safety net, it was a central pillar of the housing system. Waiting lists were short. Rents were regulated. Young families could expect to move out, start independent lives, and eventually buy a home on a single income. But slowly, the philosophy began to change. From the late 1980 onward, market-oriented reforms reshaped housing policy. Governments across Europe increasingly believed that private markets would allocate housing more efficiently than public institutions. In the Netherlands, this led to a gradual withdrawal of the state from direct housing construction. Housing corporations were pushed to become financially independent. Subsidies were reduced, new taxes were introduced. Over time, these organizations were encouraged to sell off parts of their housing stock to fund renovations or new projects, but replacements did not keep pace with sales. As a result, the share of social housing steadily declined. From nearly half of all homes in 1980, it fell to around 28% today. The system that once absorbed shocks began to thin out, quietly reducing its capacity to protect affordability. At the same time, strict zoning laws and land use regulations hardened. The Netherlands is a small country with limited land, much of it protected for agriculture, nature, or flood control. These protections serve real and important purposes. But over time, they also made expansion increasingly difficult. Municipalities retained tight control over land release. New developments required years of approvals, negotiations, and environmental assessments. Each additional regulation added cost, uncertainty, and delay. Projects that might take 2 or 3 years elsewhere could take twice as long in the Netherlands. For decades, these weaknesses remained largely hidden. Why? Because demand was manageable, population growth was slower, interest rates were higher, and housing prices, while rising, remained within reach for much of the population. But beneath the surface, a deficit was forming. By the early 2000s, the Netherlands was no longer building enough homes to match long-term demand. Annual construction fell to around 70,000 units per year, far below historical levels. Each year, the gap widened slightly, not enough to trigger alarm, but enough to accumulate over time. Meanwhile, mortgage policy amplified the problem. Generous tax deductions encouraged households to borrow more. With interest payments partially deductible, higher loans became more attractive. This increased purchasing power without increasing supply. Prices responded accordingly. Between 2000 and 2020, real incomes grew by only 3 to 5%. Housing prices rose by more than 120%. The relationship between work and housing fundamentally shifted. In the 1970 seconds, a typical home cost 4 to 5 times the average annual income. Today, that figure is closer to 11 or 12 times. What once required 1 salary now often requires 2. Even then, access is far from guaranteed. Students face their own version of the crisis. Universities expanded rapidly, attracting domestic and international students alike. But student housing construction lagged far behind enrollment growth. Cities like Groningen, Delft, and Amsterdam began reporting extreme shortages. Some students slept in gyms, others postponed studies or commuted for hours. Still, the system held together barely. Then came the shocks. In 2019, Dutch courts ruled that nitrogen emissions linked to construction violated European environmental standards. Overnight, tens of thousands of housing and infrastructure projects were halted or delayed. Planning uncertainty surged. Developers hesitated. Costs rose further. At the same time, interest rates fell to historic lows. In the 1990s, mortgages typically carried interest rates of 6 to 8%. By the 2000s, they dropped to 4 or 5%. After 2012, they plunged even further, reaching 1 to 2%. Suddenly, borrowing was cheap. Buyers could afford larger loans. Investors entered the market aggressively. Prices accelerated faster than supply could respond. According to industry estimates, the nitrogen ruling alone prevented the construction of tens of thousands of homes that would otherwise have been built. Each missed year compounded the shortage. Then the pandemic arrived. Remote work increased demand for space. Households sought larger homes. Demand spread from cities into smaller towns. What had once been an urban crisis became nationwide. And finally, population growth surged to record levels. In a single year, more than 220,000 new residents arrived. The housing system, already stretched thin, simply could not absorb the shock. What had been a slow-moving imbalance became a full-scale crisis. And this is where the feedback loops begin. When homes become scarce, prices rise. When prices rise, investors step in, and when investors step in, entry-level homes disappear. This cycle feeds on itself. Fewer affordable homes push more people into the rental market. Rising rents increase demand for social housing. Social housing systems, already weakened by decades of underinvestment, become overwhelmed. Waiting lists grow longer. Frustration deepens. At the same time, political pressure intensifies. Rising demand fuels public anxiety. That anxiety leads to more restrictive policies, tighter regulations, and slower approvals. Construction becomes harder, not easier. Each attempt to control the crisis ends up reinforcing the very forces driving it. These feedback loops make the problem incredibly difficult to unwind. The numbers are stark. To stabilize the housing market, the Netherlands needs to build at least 100,000 to 120,000 new homes every year. Instead, it builds around 70,000. The deficit does not disappear. It compounds. More than 40% of young adults still live with their parents, not by choice, but by necessity. Many delay starting families. Others postpone careers. Some leave the country altogether. A generation that expected to follow a familiar path, education, work, home ownership, stability, now finds that path increasingly out of reach. Essential workers feel the strain most acutely. Teachers, nurses, police officers, and healthcare staff often cannot afford to live near their workplaces. Hospitals struggle to recruit. Schools lose experienced staff. Public services weaken, not because demand is falling, but because workers cannot find housing. For students, housing has become a lottery. Hundreds apply for a single room. Many spend months in temporary accommodation. Others commute across borders, traveling from Belgium or Germany simply because housing ends at the national boundary while jobs do not. Businesses are beginning to feel the consequences as well. Economic growth has slowed. Investment decisions are delayed. Companies struggle to attract skilled workers who cannot secure housing. Infrastructure systems face rising pressure. Public transport strains under longer commutes. Productivity suffers quietly but steadily. This is not just a social issue. It is an economic risk. And yet, there is a paradox. On a per capita basis, the Netherlands actually builds more homes than several other European countries, but demand is rising even faster. Population growth, household fragmentation, and lifestyle changes mean that even aggressive construction may only slowly close the gap. This reveals the core challenge. The crisis is not the result of a single mistake. It is the outcome of 50 years of decisions interacting with unprecedented growth. Underbuilding accumulated quietly. Social housing capacity declined gradually. Mortgage incentives inflated prices over decades. Regulatory complexity slowed supply. Environmental constraints collided with demographic pressure. And when multiple shocks arrived at once, low interest rates, legal rulings, a pandemic, record migration, the system reached its breaking point. Housing markets are more than markets. They shape how societies function. Where people live determines access to jobs, education, healthcare, and opportunity. When housing becomes unaffordable, inequality deepens. Social mobility stalls. Trust in institutions erodes. The Netherlands still has enormous strengths. It has capital. It has expertise. It has strong institutions. It has a long history of planning and coordination. But restoring balance will not be quick or easy. Any solution will require trade-offs. Faster construction, regulatory reform, large-scale investment in affordable housing, difficult choices about land use, and a long-term commitment that extends beyond election cycles. The danger lies not in collapse, but in normalization. When scarcity becomes routine, expectations adjust downward. Young people stop expecting independence. Workers accept long commutes. Families adapt to instability. Over time, what was once unthinkable becomes normal. Living in the Netherlands did not become difficult overnight. It happened slowly, shaped by policies, incentives, and pressures that were easy to ignore until they weren't. Today, the consequences are clear. Housing remains out of reach for millions. The gap between supply and demand continues to widen, and the foundations that once supported predictable, stable growth are under strain. The question now is not whether the Netherlands can build more homes. It is whether it can restore affordability, opportunity, and balance before the damage becomes permanent. The window to act is still open, but it is narrowing.